All right, welcome back to the BBK podcast. This is your host, Brian Bullock, and thanks for hanging out with me, Ryan, with all these technical difficulties, and thanks for joining the podcast once again. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. It was well worth the wait.
Yeah, so we're doing this on Zoom because for some reason I was having problems with my Snagit program with Hangouts, and for some reason the microphone wasn't being picked up no matter what I tried here. But well, I don't want to dive too much into that. Thanks to your wife here for setting up us with this Zoom call here. As many of you might know from the last podcast and just from his previous articles that he's done, the one that we know the gambling world that was introduced to you first was the Deadspin article. And that was already 4.5 years ago, which, that time has flown by pretty fast. And there's been a lot that's gone on since then. So we're just going to kind of touch base on that before we go into some of your other more recent activities that have taken place in terms of the 30 for 30 and the different articles that you've written. So we're going to start with just kind of revisiting the Deadspin portion here. And so for those that, might not remember, you had a fun little article about RJ Bell and pregame, and you had the help of many people from Gambling Twitter who assisted with so many different things that, I couldn't imagine you being able to write that article without a lot of their help. So as far as that goes, I know that Sizzle came on the podcast earlier this year and touched base on some of that stuff, but like a very quick summary. I think in the last time we talked to you that the lawsuit was still ongoing, but it's pretty much dead in the water now, right?
Yeah. So that article came out on June 23rd, 2016, a date that I will never forget. And 364 days later, I was sued by RJ Bell he was being represented by Charles Harder, who was the lawyer who had sued Gawker on behalf of Hulk Hogan. They had sort of threatened to sue previous to that. They had actually sent, I believe, 2 demand letters demanding a retraction article, and both times Deadspin said, no chance. We stand by the reporting. And then they did sue one day short of, I guess, the closing of the statute of limitations on libel and defamation. That lawsuit was interesting in that it never actually got to the merits of the article itself or the merits of Bell's claim. Also, Charles Harder sued a reporter named Anna Merlin, who was working at Gizmodo Media Group at the time, for an article she had written. So he was representing 2 different people, and it kind of was almost like a package deal. Okay. So after almost 20 months, the lawsuit was settled. Not a single word was changed in the article. The article was not retracted. The link stayed up. There was no money exchanged. The terms of the settlement was simply that we added a maybe 4-sentence note at the top of the article, which said that this article had been in the middle of a lawsuit, and the lawsuit was settled, and we linked to a response by Bell that was hosted on the website in which he could respond further to the allegations in the article. I mean, in the article itself, we printed several statements by Bell, but this was, I guess, a further opportunity for him to respond to some of the allegations in the article. And I think he chose 12 allegations out of many.
Okay. And I guess we could, I don't know if the best spot to touch base on this on, but Sizzle was mentioning that there was a list of 28 deceptions. Is that part of what you're referencing there?
This was, think of more just, this was a distilled version of the 28 deceptions of Deadspin, okay, which was 6 days after the article came out. Bell posted on pregame, I believe it was close to 4,600 words, going through what he claimed were 28 deceptions of the article. It's hard to get through, but that was actually some of them. I'll leave it to listeners or viewers to check that out and see and compare that against the reporting of the article. But my favorite deception was probably regarding the valedictorian claims.
Oh yeah. The valedictorian at Ohio State, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
So, the lawsuit was, in many ways, felt kind of surreal because, again, it never got into the actual substance of my reporting in the article. It was kind of bound up in bankruptcy law regarding when Gawker had gone bankrupt. The bankruptcy judge, Judge Bernstein, had ruled that the staff writers, independent contractors for Gawker Media were basically protected from people who protected from future lawsuits, from people who had maybe claims to come forward to the bankruptcy court when Gawker, the proceedings over Gawker's bankruptcy, people could come forward with claims. And if they did, they typically were going to get relief from the court. Bell had that opportunity. He never did. He waited until after that year, basically, till after the bankruptcy was finished to sue. And so the lawyers on behalf of myself and Gizmo and Univision, because they were also sued, they went to the bankruptcy judge and said, you have to enforce these releases that you granted. And ultimately, he ruled that the publication itself, Univision, was not responsible and could not be sued by Bell because they hadn't published the article. It had been published by Gawker Media when Gawker owned Deadspin, but that the lawsuit against me could continue. So at that point, it was just me on the hook.
That's a little scary.
Yeah, but at that point also, I mean, I'm a freelance reporter. I've been, independent for 12 years, so I'm not exactly a deep-pocketed entity in this lawsuit. So at that point, I think, it wasn't that many months after that this thing was settled. Sure.
Yeah, and it's kind of a show at that point on his side, I'm sure. So was that the first time, in your journalistic life, that you had been involved in a lawsuit like that, where you've been the on that end of it?
Yeah, it was. It's not something that is very fun to go through, but at the same time, I kind of feel like maybe it's a bit of a rite of passage if you're doing investigative reporting that is going to raise some hackles. And sure. I always had a tremendous amount of support from the Deadspin editors that I worked with, from Gizmodo Media Group, which owned them at the time. They were phenomenal. They provided the best lawyer, the best outside counsel for me. Their own lawyers were intimately involved in the case. Bankruptcy lawyers were involved in it. I mean, it was a little surreal to sit around a table with 6 different lawyers who were all working on your case.
Sure.
So I always felt like, the article I reported for a year, everything in that story was backed up. Nothing, there was nothing in there that I saw any ever real challenge against. So, I always felt confident, obviously, that we would win. But of course, you have to go through it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's not something that I imagine, or maybe they do go through that in journalism school. I don't know if there's any classes that cover just in case you are about to get sued for something. Here's a class. I couldn't imagine maybe there is a class. I don't know. Are there classes on that?
I mean, it's a lot harder when you're freelance, because then you just are really at the whims of the publication you're working for.
Sure.
And no publication wants to be seen as not backing their reporter. Sure. But at the same time, if you're working on staff, it's agreed that your employer will defend you. As a freelancer, it's much different. So, sure. I mean, speaking of journalism students, one thing that was quite interesting was I remember when Bell sued me and was making a big, show of it, and even emailed me saying that he was a man of his word and he had promised that he would get his day in court and, defeat me, I guess. He claimed that the money he was going to win for me would pay for the scholarships for journalism students at UNLV. And when the case was settled, I put out a statement in which I said that, I would be happy to speak to those students, even though they would not be getting scholarships funded by me. I would be happy to speak to those students about investigative reporting.
Oh man, that's a good last word there. Unfortunate for them, it would be nice if they got scholarships some other way, but yeah, unfortunately they couldn't get it that way. But well, no, fortunately for you, they couldn't get it that way. One other thing that's occurred since the time of your Deadspin article, unfortunately, is the passing of one of the people who helped you with the article, groovinmahoovin, a great asset to the gambling world and just a great person in general from everything I've heard. Unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet him, but I any chance I get, I usually I've tried to name drop him a few times here since his passing, and he's very missed. But as far as his contribution to the article goes, just describe your interactions with him as you prepared the article, because I didn't really go into, I don't think the last podcast we really went into like specific people, but since with him passing, I kind of figured that he was one of the integral parts of the article, and I just kind of want to get your sense of like how big of a part he was.
Yeah, I think he was one of the first people that I spoke with when I began my reporting, which was, I remember vividly, it was April 1st, 2015. So a little, like more than a year before the story came out. And he wrote back and asked if it was an April Fool's joke that I was interested in doing this story on the tout industry. He had such a breadth of knowledge and a real history of the tout industry going back, as more than a decade. So I feel like, I'd spent my life around gambling, around betting, so I knew what I was getting into. But in terms of the history, like I hadn't been following, sports betting touts that much.
Sure.
Over the years, I followed and, bet on horse racing and followed horse racing really closely, wrote about it. So I was like familiar with, you didn't need to tell me like, what the VIG was. Like I knew the language, but
Sure.
He had been following, the industry for so many years and keeping screenshots of everything. And he was like, he was himself like a reporter who was following these folks that I ended up writing about. And as you know, like there's so many smoke screens that are put up by touts, and he was able to decipher and interpret things so that I would kind of be prepared. So, when Johnny Detroit said that when Fezzik came to pregame that he had never sold picks before, Groovin could tell me he sold picks at LVA. Like it was a forum. Okay, it wasn't exactly a tout service, but you had to pay money to get on there, and those picks were tracked. So he could basically, he knew how to clear like every hurdle that would be put up in my way. And I think just having the raw numbers, having the records, like he had been compiling that stuff. He also knew who to talk to. Bettors who had used pregame touts had gotten in touch with him, so he could introduce me to them as well. And I think another thing too was that he was very familiar with the early years of the tout business, the affiliate marketing, the book referrals, and he had saved screenshots of everything. So I remember quite vividly that after I was sued, like he sent me an email with like 100 links, many of which I already had sent me before, but these were all links and screenshots and saved archived websites that I could use and would be able to use, like, and just continue to, prove and back up all the reporting that was in my article.
Yeah, and I would have loved to have seen his like hard drive just to see how many different folders he had of like just like the subfolders within the folders of just, based on like everything I've seen of him, I saw of him when he was posting on Twitter all the time. I know he was very thorough, and you know, he, like you said, he has a kind of a journalistic mindset of like, he would have been a good investigative reporter if he really wanted to be. I feel like with his tenacity and gathering of data. So yeah, I wanted to make sure I brought that up before while you were on here, because that was something that as far as him being gone, like it's been a big void in the gambling Twitter world, and he benefited so many different people. Just I know that was one of the most complimented podcasts that I had. I've had my share of duds, but that was the one that like I'm always glad to promote. The ones that he did with me. He was always so kind with his time and just kind with his information that when he didn't have to be, because whenever you give up an edge as a gambler, even if it's like a very small thing, it's he was very gracious with his time, and I wanted to get that perspective from you too in terms of what he provided to the article. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I think like if I could just say one more thing.
Sure.
I think it's just a real treat as a reporter when you work on a story and you meet people who are so knowledgeable about that world. I mean, we kind of, like as a reporter, sometimes you drop into a world and you have to get up to speed really quickly, and you really depend on people who have such a deep knowledge of the world you're entering. And I can't think of anybody that knew more about the tout industry than Groovin, and like you said, could just pull like on a dime, like, in a matter of minutes, pull up some screenshot to prove a point. And even just very minor, not minor things, but things that were really small that told a very big story. I'll never forget, around sort of, a post of a tout on pregame trying to distance themselves from certain maybe sportsbook referrals they had and saying, email us instead of email them, and he remembered that and he knew the date and he could pull it up pretty quickly. So,
yeah. Well, he's very missed, and, like I said, I appreciate you sharing that. And, I feel like the article wouldn't have been able to happen without him. I mean, maybe you disagree, but it seems like it would have been a very big hole in the article if you couldn't talk to him about a lot of this stuff. So, so as far as like future articles about this, has there been any has there been anyone that's approached you saying like, hey, here's another sort of thing? Like I know that pregame was sort of like, the big fish at the time that was written, but has there been anything that's crept up since then that's like that somebody's brought to your attention that said, that maybe raised some flags of like, hey, maybe I could, report on this in the future? Or
not too many things. I mean, I've kind of followed what some folks, I don't know if it's called Contrarianville anymore, Seville. I don't know. I guess have followed Seville folks to see what they're looking at and maybe who they're following, who they're tracking. But nothing that no stories that have really come my way. I kind of feel like, especially after the article and then obviously being sued a year later and then being embroiled in a lawsuit for 20 months, maybe now's the time. People can come to me now. I have like a fret, and now I have many years of like, processing this. So now I'm ready for another gambling story.
Yeah. Who doesn't want a lawsuit every 4 years in their lives? There's a void in your life right now that you need to fill. Okay, so let's go into the next piece here that you wrote. And this is actually an article that you wrote shortly after the Deadspin article, shortly after, like it was published about like a year later. The one about, and I'm very bad at pronouncing things. So the Tarahumara, is that?
You're close.
I'm very bad. People who listen to this know that I butcher pronunciations almost on a consistent basis. So if you drank to my mispronunciations, you'd be pretty drunk after an hour. The article that you wrote about 3 years ago got turned into a 30 for 30. And before we get into the 30 for 30, what inspired you to write this piece about these runners?
Yeah, so the story, Tarahumara is, and I'm not even saying it that well, but they're known as the Tarahumara, and they call themselves the Raramari. That's their name for themselves. This was an article that actually I started working on right around the same time that I started working on this story about pregame, so the summer of 2015. Ultimately, the story came out for Texas Monthly in July of 2017. It was actually just on the day that I found out I was being sued, I found out that there was like 20% of the article was being cut. So that was like not a, that was like a tough morning. But the story that came out was really wonderful. I worked with some phenomenal editors at Texas Monthly, and that's just an incredible publication that does just great storytelling. So this story that I wrote was called The Drug Runners. I started working on it in the summer of 2015. So just maybe to backtrack, the Tarahumara, they're an indigenous tribe of about 70,000 that live in some of the most remote, hard to get to places on the continent in northern Mexico and the Sierra Madre Mountains within the state of Chihuahua. And they kind of became maybe sort of popularized by a book called Born to Run that was written by Christopher McDougall that came out in 2009. It was a bestseller about an American guy named Micah True had really kind of dropped off the map, moved down to the Sierra Madre Mountains to live with the Tarahumara and try to maybe help revive some of their running traditions. Their name for themselves, the Raramari, actually means running people or people with light feet. And so this is, a group of people where running is part of their traditions and cultures. It's even part of their religion. They run to give thanks. They run to ask for rain. So in the summer of 2015, what I started looking into was I saw that an ultramarathon race that was actually started by this guy, Micah True, who was known as Caballo Blanco. And this book, Born to Run, really focused on the first ultramarathon race that Caballo Blanco had started in 2006, bringing some of the best elite ultramarathon runners from outside Mexico, from the U.S. down to Mexico, to these remote, rugged canyons to race against the best of the Tarahumara. So anyway, this ultramarathon race continued going on and became more and more popular. It almost kind of became like the running of the bulls for, elite athletes, people who would want to run a 50-mile race down in the middle of a canyon in the middle of some really, hard to get to place in Mexico. So this race in 2015 was actually called off because of violence between two warring cartels in Mexico that were really fighting for control of the state of Chihuahua and the growing, the land to grow poppy and marijuana where the Tarahumara live. So I saw that this race had been canceled and just wanted to know more about it. And that kind of started really 2 years of reporting and writing of this story. And what happened, what I started to find out was that many of the Tarahumara were being recruited by the cartels into running drugs because of their endurance and because they needed the money and because their land was being stolen by cartels. They were being recruited to run drugs into the U.S., where if they were arrested, ended up serving pretty long prison sentences. So my article ultimately kind of got into this group of people, the threats against their way of life, and then also the real crushing nature of the criminal justice system, especially down the border, where they were being treated as if they were drug kingpins like El Chapo instead of the lowest kind of people on the drug trafficking totem pole.
Yeah, and that was one of the few articles where I actually read some of the comments. Like I had to I reread your story because I read it in 2017 and I loved it. And I remember reaching out to you and complimenting you on it. But then like I had to reread it just because I wanted to refresh myself on it and because I wanted to see like how it compared to the documentary. And I actually read the comments on some of that and like the focus of the geopolitical nature of the article that I didn't really think of it in those terms when I was watching the documentary or even when I read the article. Like I wasn't actively thinking of the geopolitical aspects of it, but once I read like that particular comment that somebody wrote about that, I was like, oh crap, like our our need for like our need for these illegal drugs to get across the border, like driven by this cartel, like just the different like layers to it that like might not be like readily apparent when you initially read the article, but it's just like it kind of gave me a little bit of chills. Like wow, it's just like so deep. Like there's like so many different layers to this that that you can report on and just yeah. Well, that was one of the few times where I recommended reading the comments. Like, there's very nice like compliments to your article on there. That was one of the ones that struck me. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But in terms of the setting forth in your investigation of the article, was there anything that like when you were when you were investigating it, and I'm sure when you investigate things in general, you're probably trying to keep a blank slate and you're not trying to enter your bias into your reporting, which I'm sure is probably impossible to avoid even like when you're trying to present a objective article. Like I don't think you can avoid a certain level of bias. But was there anything that you found in your reporting that you were like really caught off guard by when you were digging this up?
Yeah, there were so many surprising things along the way. Certainly when I started reporting the story, I wasn't aware that Tarahumara, members of the community were being recruited to run drugs. Like I was unaware of that. And I just knew that this ultramarathon race was canceled because of cartel violence. So I knew a little bit, I quickly learned that where they live, given its remote nature, given its fertile land, that it was really the hotbed of growing drugs like on the continent. I mean, so much, and like you were talking about with the connections and the geopolitical aspect, so much of the heroin that was coming into the U.S. that was plaguing and has been plaguing so many communities, it's coming from this area of Mexico. And the Tarahumara, they weren't running poppy, they were like always running marijuana, which when you think about the injustice of that, I mean, they were carrying a drug that, was legal in many states and is even now legal in many more states than it was in 2015 or earlier. So,
yeah.
So I think, for me, that maybe one of the biggest surprises was, given that I was writing the story for Texas Monthly, it was important to me to be able to describe and get to know people in that part of the state, really far west Texas, where many drug backpackers, as they're called, were being arrested on, almost a daily basis, and then are filling federal prisons in Texas. So, I ended up through my reporting getting the names of a few Tarahumara who had buried drugs in the U.S. and had been arrested and were serving, I think in some cases between 3 and 5 years in federal prison for a first offense. And I then met the lawyer of one of those men, and this guy that lawyer was named Paul Chambers. And Paul, I wrote about in my article. His family was like kind of the legendary ranching family down in far west Texas, near Big Bend. And it was once I got to talking to Paul, like his family had really been embroiled in sort of the drug war as well. And it was those experiences that kind of drove him to become a lawyer and wanting to represent people who weren't getting a fair shake. So that was an element to the story that I really could not have predicted. Paul's father had been arrested in the early 90s when he was very young for the largest cocaine bust in Texas history at that point, and served about, I think maybe 13 or 14 years in prison. And so Paul's father was taken from him at a very young age and started moving around with his family, and many other members of his family were arrested for, drug use. And he felt like the criminal justice system was basically punishing members of his family for, addictions or illnesses that they were having trouble, being able to cope with. And so that connection between Paul Chambers' family history and his own experience with that of the people he was representing, I thought was something I stumbled into, but I thought was quite poignant.
And if I remember in the article, Chambers was mentioning that he thinks he was like in like 30 or 40 different schools. I don't have the figure in front of me, but it was like an insane amount of like different schools that he attended in his lifetime. It was, I don't know.
All the time.
Having that instability can't, it's amazing he turned out as well as he did. Kind of probably the exception to the rule. So as far as the race itself, do you, like with your reporting, was there anyone that like was inspired to do the race because of your article? Do you know, like, is anyone personally, or like anyone reached out to you, say like, yeah, I'm doing this because, you brought this to light. Like I'd never heard of the race before I read this. And I'm sure many people maybe outside of the, I'm sure people who read the book, Born to Run, knew about it, but maybe some people who, in your personal life, maybe that explored that track, or, I don't know. Did you do the track yourself? Like I'm asking a lot of questions here, but I guess you can start with like the part where I was asking about the, if anyone else has raced this that you know of, like personally, and like what they thought of it.
Nobody, probably some people after reading my article wouldn't want to go and run.
I mean, that's
that, like the race is being basically in the middle of like a cartel dominated area. They probably want to stay away.
That's probably true. I mean, I guess there could be some like people who like enjoy some risk in their life, but yeah, that's a very good point. But did you get a chance to explore the did you get, like, in your investigation of this, did you get a chance to like at least walk the path that they like run?
Yeah, so I went to the Copper Canyon in October of 2016 to meet some of the people that I wrote about, one of whom was Silvino Kubesari, who is this champion runner of the Tarahumara community, and was in his kind of late 30s at the time, had been one of the top runners in the ultramarathon Caballo Blanco previously. And Silvino was the main subject of my article. He had, run drugs into the U.S. previously and had been arrested for that. So when I went, it was to really watch him in an ultramarathon race that was in a town called Saracawi. And so I didn't go for like the Caballo Blanco, which is the big ultramarathon there every March. But the race I went to was slightly shorter. It wasn't the same route, but it was in a similar region, slightly different canyon, like a little higher up. But it was up in the mountains. It started, I think, maybe around 5,400 feet, and then kind of grew by maybe about 1,000, 1,500 feet elevation. That was, I think, 37 miles. So it was like a slightly shorter ultramarathon. I, of course, was not running it myself, but I was with the race organizer and a few other people, and we followed Silvino in like an off-road, a truck with very good, off-road capacity, following on the race route and sort of being at certain checkpoints along the race when Silvino came up. So I do remember at one point that car that they dropped me off to go get photos of a sort of a famous overlook along the trail. And they dropped me off, and I was standing on the race route, which was a road, but it was really just like a collection of rocks and dirt. And it was on an old Tarahumara foot trail that probably was millennia old. I mean, and probably 40 years ago, engineers said, well, that hugs the mountain. That looks like a really great way and the quickest way to get down and up the mountain. So let's build a road there. And I was standing there after being dropped off, and they said, we'll be back in a few minutes. And I'm waiting longer than a few minutes. And there was not a soul in sight. It was completely quiet. All I heard were birds. And it was probably like the quietest place on earth at that moment in time. And it was just beautiful. It really was. And I was waiting there for Silvino to come around the bend. He finally came around the bend, kind of gave me a little nod. I nodded back, and then he sort of kept going along the trail that like was so narrow when it went off the road that only one person could fit at a time.
Now, are you? I presume that you're bilingual to be able to like have these interviews with with them.
I wish. Or do you? I actually had a translator.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I mean, I have like really, really poor. I speak really poorly, so I mean, enough to like be able to greet and I took Spanish for a long time in grade school, but like suburban New Jersey public school, I don't think like we had the best Spanish curriculum. So
oh man,
yeah, I took Spanish for like 11 years and never became fluent. So I could understand a lot, but I always had a translator and someone who was kind of knew the people I was interviewing, and there was already a sort of familiarity and trust that was there.
Okay. Yeah, because I was gonna say, I would have guessed that you were, just because it seemed like you were very integrated within the story. So like, but yeah, having in this case, it probably helped to have the translator. So as far as the documentary goes, did you have to give any sort of permission, or was that a Texas the Texas Monthly, or sorry, the runner? I'm butchering the name, but who basically had to sign off on that? I guess I really don't know the legalese behind that.
So, after the story came out, there was like some sort of fleeting interest by maybe some production studios in making a film based on the article, but those never panned out. And then in late sort of 2018, so I guess maybe a little more than a year after the story came out, I was contacted by ESPN Films. They had seen the article and had also at the time, they were in conversation with Bernardo Ruiz, who was the director of this film, which is called The Infinite Race. And they were had been talking to Bernardo, who's an Emmy nominated director. He's an incredible filmmaker and had made several films about the drug war. He made a film about a magazine in Mexico and the threats that journalists face. So they sent him the article and, introduced us to see if maybe there could be, the roots of a documentary there. And we hit it off. And I think, I kind of shared with him everything that I had learned and people that I had met and people who were well connected and lived in the Sierra Madre, in the Sierra Tarahumara. And, he kind of took it from there. I mean, he'd made films in Mexico before, and he's Mexican-American. So, he, knew how to get to Mexico quickly to film this race. They filmed the ultramarathon Caballo Blanco in 2019 and followed Silvino Kubesri, who I mentioned was kind of one of the main subjects of my article, a really incredible activist named Irma Chavez, who I also wrote about, and who, is doing so much to try to preserve the traditions of her people and facing threats, in the process. And they also focused on a teenage runner named Catalina Rascon, who won her first ultramarathon race when she was 12 or 13. And, they filmed for about a year or so. And, actually the film would have had its kind of premiere at a few film festivals this past spring, but because of the pandemic, they weren't able to do that. And then, it aired just a few weeks ago. So I think it's an incredible film. I think they did an amazing job. They did such justice to the people that were the centerpiece of the film. I mean, when I was doing my reporting, I came across a few, maybe one or two documentaries about the Tarahumara, and some maybe shorter kind of news pieces, there was nothing that was ever that good or that informative. Most of them typically had like, white Americans as talking heads talking about the Tarahumara.
Yeah.
And what Bernardo and his team did was they made a film where it was like they got to speak for themselves. Why have outsiders speak for someone else? And
Yeah.
I was an outsider, and I find it hard to even, feel like I can speak for, I never want to speak for someone else, but, I feel really privileged to tell this story. And I think the film that they made is just really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think one thing that people forget to do so many times, it's so simple, is just to listen. Just to listen to the people who experience it. And like, I don't know anything about that. And, and you know way more about this than I do. And even you don't feel qualified to talk about it. Like, you let the people who are living this talk about it. And, I think it came across really well. And I was, the part that I was talking about with the I think, and I don't think this was when we were recording, but like this was when I was having problems with the recording, is when I was talking about the part that TV brought out was like the visuals of like the paths, and it's like I was just like I was blown away by the visuals of northern Mexico. Like, I was like I didn't know how that looked. The remote areas, it's very beautiful. Like, and the visuals were great, and the storytelling was great. And the 30 for 30s as far as ESPN goes are like, in my opinion, the best thing that they do. And I'm glad. I feel like based on what you're saying, it feels like you feel like they did justice to your article that you wrote.
Totally. And they took it in a new and interesting direction. And some of the things that I felt like for me, maybe slowed me up or just made it so, for example, not being bilingual, makes things like a little harder, and maybe you lose a little bit. Maybe I lost a little bit of, connection that would be possible. And, they didn't, that wasn't an issue they were dealing with. And at the same time, being able to go down for several weeks, and they filmed there on multiple occasions for, a good period of time. You just get to, see more. And, the opening shot of the film and the last shot of the film is from a traditional Raramuri race called the Rarahipiri, where it's two teams. It's a men's race where two teams are running sometimes for 50, 100, or even 200 miles. And they're kicking a ball along the way, along a sort of predetermined course.
Yeah.
This was so beautiful, and like that's almost never been filmed before. And they're able to do it with, also state-of-the-art equipment with drones, and capturing that was just stunning. The opening shots of the film just floored me.
Yeah, and that like you said, the tradition, the way they were running with, like you described, it was like I didn't. Was that mentioned in your article? If it was, I might have missed it, or maybe just kind of forgot about it. But it was they captured it very well, like how they got into running, and like and I don't know if they could have done more discussing the cartel, but that aspect of it too is just like you can understand why they make the decisions they make. If you start thinking about it in terms of like, what would you do for your family? If you were desolate, you would do the same things that they did for their families. You would risk, prison sentences, and as much as like people might want to demonize like what they're doing, who's to say we wouldn't do the same thing? We probably would if we were in their spot.
Yeah. I mean, the choices that people are forced to make there are really unlike many choices that we have to face.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's not fair to them, but like that's what they're faced with. That's their reality, and just to see that captured both in the article and the 30 for 30 was you have to be able to think you have to be able to put yourself in their shoes, people's shoes sometimes to like gain some perspective of like why they make their decisions. You know, they might not be the right ones, but they made them for themselves.
It's not
and
a choice. Yeah, sorry to interrupt
yeah,
you, but a lot of times
no,
it's not a choice either. It's
yeah, no, oh no, it's either death or prison. Like, you know,
or
you're gonna
back.
or risk of prison. You know, you're gonna most people aren't gonna choose death. So
Yeah.
okay, so we'll transition into the last part here in terms of the horse racing pieces. Unless you have a final comment about the that you wanted to make about the 30 for 30.
Well, I just was going to say one thing that I like what you said about listening and that being so important. And one thing that I felt like was really special about the Infinite Race was the main interview that Bernardo Ruiz, the director, did with Silvino was in his native language, in Raramuri. He speaks Spanish. Silvino is, he speaks Spanish, but not all Raramuri actually do speak Spanish. Some who live in some really remote areas of the Sierra Tarahumara do not speak Spanish, or some that do might have just kind of like bus station Spanish. So, Bernardo did that interview in Raramuri. So that takes a lot of work. It was like, asking the question, and then someone will translate it into Raramuri. Silvino answer in Raramuri, and then translate it back into Spanish, so there's like multiple levels, but that shows like an authenticity, I feel like, and a real, desire to respect. Thank you. Yeah.
Respect. Yeah.
To say, this is your native language. This is how you will be able to express yourself most vividly and, most eloquently. So let's do it in that, So I thought that was really cool. And also like hearing the native language on the film, like there's a real beautiful quality to it as well.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, let's go into the horse racing pace. So now that I usually like to let you wrap it up, or whoever wrap it up if need be. So so as far as the horse racing pieces go, I know that in the last podcast when you introduced yourself from a gambling perspective, you had like a pretty as far as your gambling background, you were horse racing was your thing in terms of gambling. Like that was what you knew. So it's not a surprise to me that you have like so many different horse racing pieces. So like the two most recent ones that you've written, like you call them companion pieces. The Man Who Would Kill Horse Racing and the Death of a Racehorse. You're speaking from a perspective of somebody who grew up with horse racing, who seems to know quite a bit about it. So before we get into like some of the questions about the pieces, I don't know how you could summarize two articles very shortly or quickly, but how would you describe like a quick summary of those who might not have read it?
Sure. So the first piece you mentioned, The Man Who Would Kill Horse Racing, was published by Deadspin in September 2019, just like a few weeks before the Deadspin staff walked out. And so I felt really fortunate that that story came out before then, and I got to work with Barry Paczewski, who is the editor I've worked with on all my Deadspin pieces on that one. That story was looking at a anti-horse racing activist named Patrick Petuello, who lives just outside Albany, and who has kind of committed himself to trying to lead an abolition campaign against horse racing. And he's the editor, writer, or founder of a website called horseracingwrongs.com. And on that website is very unabashed in kind of gathering all the evidence he can to make a case for why horse racing should not exist, why it's too brutal, and why it's inhumane. And I mean, he's reviled within the horse racing industry for obvious reasons, but through that website, like, he is constantly getting public record searches from state horse racing commissions to try to compile the kind of the names and the list of horses that are killed every year at U.S. racetracks. So my story was kind of a profile of Betuello, and it's sort of asking the question of how many horses actually do die every year at U.S. racetracks, because the industry is not making that information public in any centralized way. The second story, which, like you said, it was kind of a companion piece, and I kind of started working on it at the same time. It's called The Death of a Racehorse, and it was published by Vice Features in October, this past October, and that was about a exercise rider named Jimmy Rivera, who was paralyzed when the horse he was riding, named Fly, Fly, Fly Delilah, broke down in the fall of 2008 at Calder Racecourse in right near Miami. And that story was kind of looking at the regulatory failures that led up to, or, if not were the cause of the accident, they kind of led up to and preceded Jimmy Rivera's kind of tragic accident. And, something on the order of, I think, 62 horses died that year at Calder. So, and the lack of any investigation into why horses were dying for years. My story was kind of an exploration of that history, the history of deregulation in Florida, and the fact that finding out why horses are dying on the track is not really that important to the officials in Florida horse racing.
Yeah, and I knew that racehorsing was slimy. Like, I even when betting it in the past, like, there's just a certain degree of, like, you kind of know what you're getting into when you're betting it. Like I'm speaking from our perspective, or whoever's betting from it perspective. I knew there was, like, a certain level of slime, like, involved. Like, but I didn't realize how unregulated it was until I read these pieces. Just kind of like, it gave me the, like, shivers. Like, it's like, how could this be so unregulated? Like, this is why regulations in industries exist, to prevent crap like this from, getting as out of control as this, sounds like it is. Because for that, for all these different tracks that were mentioned in that article about, like, how many different, like, how quickly horses die, but then, like, they don't really give a crap of, like, if it's a training day, like, or a non-horse racing day. Like, they don't really, like, there's nothing tracking that stuff. And it's like, how are you not tracking, like, everything? Like, maybe I'm so used to different industries being regulated that I'm not thinking, like, all right, well, there's probably a reason why they don't want this regulated. So, like, were you surprised by how much slime there was too? Like, even more than you probably even knew beforehand?
Well, I had been, been around horse racing since I was probably, I think, 11. So I think there's not a lot that surprised me, and I've done a lot of reporting on horse racing previously about issues of drugs and medication abuse in the industry, and kind of seeing over time, like, how little changed, or if there was reform, it was really just kind of a very mild reform around drug policies. So I guess there wasn't a ton that surprised me. I think what was surprising to me was, at least with the article I wrote for Deadspin about the Patrick Betuello, the activist, was, like, just the sheer number of horses that die every year on the racetrack. Like, I knew the numbers were high, but I didn't know that it was definitely, more than 1,000. And, the industry releases a number that is only horses that die within, I believe, 72 hours of a race. They're not including horses that die training. They're not including horses that may have an injury during the race, but then die more than 72 hours later. They're not. They never include horses that die in their stall of, illness or disease or conditions that are caused by, the hard rigors of horse racing. So, that was the number that Betuello was compiling every year. and, you know, the number is more than 1,000. And he often argues that that number could be safely doubled because there are lots of training centers and farms in the U.S. that are not reporting their fatalities to the various racing commissions that regulate racing in their states. So I never saw any disputing of that 2,000 number by anyone in the industry.
Okay.
And so I don't think I think I was surprised that that number was as high as it was. You know, and look, people in horse racing, you know, love to talk about how the horses are, you know, like family, or they're athletes. And they are, you know, they're like, you know, incredible equine athletes. But, you know, in any sport, there is much more of an account. There's a real accounting of if those athletes are dying, you know, I mean, and so I think, you know, it was maybe surprising to me that, you know, maybe there is some industry database that does have all this information. They just don't want it to be out in the public. But, you know, there ought to be a centralized database where you can search a racehorse and see what happened to that racehorse. You know, it just,
Sure.
you know, instead of filing freedom of information requests of 38 different state racing commissions in the U.S.
Yeah, I was like when we were first talking about doing this podcast, I was recalling I went to a track, Belmaro, and it was in it's in Crete, Illinois, or was, and it closed down like
Harness racing, right?
Yeah, it was like 5 or 6 years ago, and I was, you know, the one race that I went to, the last race, there was a horse that like collapsed, and they put that curtain up that you described, and you know, did what they needed to do to kill the horse. And I was trying to find like the date that it happened, because I you know, I just forgot. You know, I don't know if it was like, you know, 10 years ago, 11 years ago. But you know, you know, I couldn't find it, but I ended up stumbling upon that site that you mentioned with the guy with him tracking the deaths of the horses. And you know, the fact that there's, you know, if there is a centralized database, somebody doesn't want to share it. So it's unfortunate. Is that something that, with, you know, over time, have you found yourself betting less on horses, or just stopping betting on horses altogether?
Yeah, I haven't bet on horse racing in probably maybe 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like I have a lot of really close friends and that still work in horse racing. You know, that's their livelihood, and that are not like, you know, they're kind of like wondering like, what's Ryan doing? Why is he doing this? You know, what's the deal? Like, does he hate horse racing? You know, because as you mentioned, and I alluded to, like, I grew up going to the racetrack. I got my start in journalism writing about horse racing when I was 16 for the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey. I started working at the Daily Racing Forum when I was 18. And, you know, so I was like writing for industry publications for a long time. And, you know, my feelings, my sentiment has changed. And that's not like, I mean, I wrote about what I'm writing about isn't changing too much from what I wrote about maybe before, in terms of trying to investigate things that are happening, wrongdoing, corruption, you know, but, you know, maybe I think the horse racing industry wants you to kind of air that, you know, maybe within, or don't write about these things for non-industry publications, you know, and like, I don't know, I think I just feel like, you know, these are important subjects, and, you know, if people have issues with my reporting, like, they're free to challenge that. But like, there's a lot that happens in horse racing that to the outside world, like, just does not seem right. And I think that's why, obviously, there was such a uproar over the deaths at Santa Anita in 2018, 2019, you know, that ever since then, really, there's just been a lot closer scrutiny on horse racing. But what happened at Santa Anita was not exceptional. You know, the number of horses that died in this particular span that, you know, created so much media attention, that was like not out of, that was basically on about average of what they
Okay, so one of the questions, and this was one of the questions, and I guess this could kind of wrap it up too, because you've already mentioned the Sizzle's 28 Deceptions thing. So the other question was from a One Big Holiday, and this kind of ties into the horse racing piece about the industry dying out. And he was wondering, first of all, do you get a lot of crap from the diehard racing crazies, and also what the odds of the industry not existing are in 20 years?
Hey, Brian, I lost your video. I don't know if you can turn it back on or...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, so yeah, as far as the end here, the question that we had from One Big Holiday was about do you get a lot of crap from the diehard racing crazies, and also the odds of the industry dying within the next 20 years?
I don't get a lot of crap. I maybe got a few emails after the story I wrote about Patrick Vituello, because he really is like public enemy number one horse racing. And I think there were some people that were a little upset that maybe I profiled him. I didn't really hear much about the story I wrote in Vice. I think like maybe there's just like no point in maybe engaging with the stories if like, if like, you're a diehard fan, like what, I mean, I think the fact is many people, most people in horse racing know that it's a pretty, can be a pretty deadly, endeavor. And I think, people who are maybe diehard know as well as anyone, like the trainers who seem to pull off miracles with horses in terms of, why is this horse able to turn around its form so rapidly? They're probably well aware with, if they're at the track every day, they're well aware with, the number of breakdowns. So as far as like, will horse racing be around? I mean, I think it will. I think it will probably be contracted and in like a smaller version than what it is now, where maybe, a handful of the, most prominent tracks are still running. But I think, the number of horses that are being born every year is down significantly from what it was 10 or 20 years ago. A lot of racetracks in the U.S. are really dependent upon slot revenues at the racetrack, or at casinos nearby, these kind of racinos where horse racing kind of takes a back seat to, the other gambling there. And so there are some states right now that are considering whether or not they want to be giving revenue from slots to prop up the horse racing industry in their state when they can give it to something, say, like education. So I think horse racing might find it hard in an age of like, shattered state budgets in the time we're in right now. They might find it hard to make the case that, that money should be going towards horse racing instead of like something else. And so I think the tracks that will end up maybe surviving and doing okay are ones where the purse money they're giving out is basically deriving from the money that's being bet, which is like how it always was until these racinos came on the scene.
Okay. All right. And I think we kind of touched base on the Sizzle question before about the 28 Deceptions. That was the only other question that we had. Was there anything that you wanted to wrap up in terms of the horse racing piece or the running piece, or any final thoughts that you wanted to present before we sign off?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say about my last piece, the one for Vice, The Death of a Racehorse, I think like even though it was about horse racing, I think this story in there could be extrapolated to basically any industry where there's been significant deregulation and just a lack of, even the rules on the books are not being followed. And so I thought that story was a kind of tale of, many industries that are, sort of privatized or oversight is outsourced or just, tossed aside. So I think even though that story is about horse racing, it could be a story about, it could be a story about, it could relate to Florida's pandemic response, and a lot of industries that have been allowed to operate in that state with kind of, impunity.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Ryan, once again, I appreciate your patience through all this recording nonsense. I appreciate your time with going into depth about the stories that you've written, and they're well done. And I wish you continued success in your long form reads here, and hopefully hopefully you're able to continue to do this even through the pandemic, and hopefully you and your wife and your loved ones stay safe, and hope you have a great new year.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It was a lot
Yeah.
of fun.
Yeah, and everyone, once again, thanks for listening. Have a happy new year, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.